Happy Wednesday, boys and girls. Open up your flat Stanley book to chapter 3, Stanley the Kite. It is found on page 17. I'll give you a couple seconds to find that page. All right, let's get started. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys out with him on Sunday afternoons to a museum or roller skating in the park, but it was difficult when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. Stanley and Arthur would often be jostled from his side, and Mr. Lambchop worried about speeding taxis or that hurrying people might accidentally knock them down. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Why do you think it would be easier for them to walk after Stanley got flat? Let's see if we can find out. Mr. Lambchop discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string for himself. It was as simple as carrying a parcel, and he could hold on to Arthur with the other hand. Stanley did not mind being carried because he had never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It made him mad. One Sunday afternoon, in the street, they met Ralph Jones, an old college friend of Mr. Lambchop's. "Well, George, I see you have bought some wallpaper," said Mr. Jones. "Going to decorate your house, I suppose?" What did Mr. Jones think was wallpaper? Right, he thought Stanley was wallpaper because Stanley was all rolled up. "Wallpaper?" said Mr. Lambchop. "Oh no, this is my son Stanley." He undid the string and Stanley unrolled. "How do you do?" Stanley said. Look at Arthur. You can tell he's mad. Turn the page. "Nice to meet you, young feller," said Mr. Jones. "George," he said to Mr. Lambchop, "that boy is flat." "Smart, too," Mr. Lambchop said. "Stanley is third from the top in his class at school." "Phooey," said Arthur. "This is my younger son, Arthur," Mr. Lambchop said, "and he will apologize for his rudeness." Arthur could only blush and apologize. Mr. Lambchop rolled Stanley up again, and they set out for home. It rained quite hard while they were on the way. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges, but Arthur got soaked. Kind of seems like Arthur's not enjoying this because he feels like Stanley's getting special treatment, doesn't he? Let's keep reading. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise out in the living room. They found Arthur lying on the floor near the bookcase. He had piled a great many volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, on top of himself. "Put some more on me," Arthur said when he saw them. "Don't just stand there. Help me." What is Arthur trying to do, boys and girls? He is trying to make himself flat. Let's keep reading. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop sent him back to bed, but the next morning they spoke to Stanley. "Arthur can't help being jealous," they said. "Be nice to him. You're his big brother, after all." The next Sunday, Stanley and Arthur went to the park by themselves. The day was sunny, but windy too, and many older boys were flying beautiful, enormous kites with long tails made in all the colors of the rainbow. Arthur sighed. "Someday," he said, "I will have a big kite, and I will win a kite flying contest and be famous like everyone else. Nobody knows who I am these days." Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. "You can fly me, Arthur," he said. "Come on." Now let's stop there. How do you think that's going to work? Arthur's going to fly flat Stanley. Let's look at the picture. It's going to give us some hints. Let's continue reading now. He attached the string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold. He ran lightly across the grass, sideways to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the breeze. Up, 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 up went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to manage on the gusts of wind. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise, and let it take him from behind when he wanted to speed. He had only to turn his thin edge to the wind, carefully, a little at a time so that it did not hold him. And then he would slip gracefully down toward the earth again. Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees, a beautiful sight in his red shirt and blue trousers against the pale blue sky. Do you guys know what trousers mean? Trousers is a synonym for pants, so he was wearing blue pants. Everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley swooped right and then left in long, matched swoops. He held his arms by his sides and zoomed at the ground like a rocket and curved up again toward the sun. He side-slipped and circled and made figure eights and crosses and a star. Nobody has ever flown the way Stanley Lambchop flew that day. Probably no one ever will again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running about with the empty spool. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda pop. Arthur left the spool wedged in the fork of a tree. He did not notice, while he was eating the hot dog, that the wind was blowing the string and tangling it about the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley did not realize how low he was until leaves brushed his feet, and then it was too late. He got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up to set him free. How would that make you feel if you were Stanley and your brother left you there? Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening and at bedtime. Even though Arthur had apologized, he was still cross. Cross would be a synonym for mad, so he was still mad even though Arthur had apologized. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mrs. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. "You're at the office all day having fun," she said. "You don't realize what I go through with the boys. They're very difficult." "Kids are like that," Mr. Lambchop said. "Phases. Be patient, dear." And that is the end of chapter 3. We will do chapter 4 tomorrow.